There's a moment I keep coming back to. I'm standing in a glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor, and my brother is at the podium in front of 40 investors, talking about vision and disruption, and the future he's building. And I'm watching him use slides I've never seen before, numbers I recognize but didn't authorize. And I'm thinking, he has no idea I'm the one who can end this. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Vivian. I'm 31 years old, and for most of my life, my family treated me like a footnote in my brother's story. His name is Theo. 4 years older, 6 inches taller, and according to my parents, the reason our family had anything to be proud of. Theo the entrepreneur. Theo the visionary. Theo, who started his first company at 22, a meal prep service that lasted 4 months, and left 3 suppliers unpaid. And my parents still called him brave. I called myself quiet. That was the word I used for a long time. Quiet, like it was a personality trait and not a survival strategy. The truth is, I learned early that being loud in our house meant being compared. Every time I said something I was proud of, my mother would tilt her head and say something like, "That's wonderful, honey. Did you hear Theo got a mention in that business newsletter?" I stopped saying things I was proud of. I stopped saying much at all. What I did instead was work. I studied finance at a state school while Theo got partial funding for a private university, money my parents scraped together because, as my father put it, Theo's degree will pay off for all of us. Mine was funded by loans and a part-time job at an insurance office where I learned, accidentally, that I was very good at seeing patterns in numbers that other people missed. After graduation, I took a job at a mid-sized investment firm in Chicago. Nothing glamorous. I wore the same 4 blazers on rotation and ate lunch at my desk and stayed until 8 most nights because I genuinely loved the work. I loved the way a spreadsheet could tell you the truth about a company when its press releases lied. I loved the way risk had a shape if you looked at it long enough. I got promoted twice in 3 years. Then I moved to a larger firm. Then, at 28, I was recruited by a venture capital fund called Aldercrest Capital. I need you to understand what Aldercrest is, because it matters later. It's not a household name. It's not supposed to be. We don't do splashy announcements. We manage a fund of about $340 million, and we are quiet and precise, and we have a reputation in certain circles for being the people who either save your company or end it, depending on what the numbers say. I became a managing director 18 months after joining. At 31, I am the youngest managing director in the firm's history and the only woman currently at that level. My family knew I worked in finance. That's all they knew because that's all I told them. Finance, to my mother, meant something like bank teller. She once asked me, at Thanksgiving, whether I got good benefits. I said yes. She said that was smart, having a stable job with benefits, and then she turned to Theo and asked how his latest venture was coming along. His latest venture was a company called Vantix, a B2B software platform for logistics optimization, real technology, actually, with a real product. Theo hadn't built it alone. His co-founder, a quiet engineer named Raj, had done most of the technical architecture, but Theo was the face of it, the salesman, the one in the pitch decks and the LinkedIn posts and the local business journal profiles. My parents talked about Vantix the way some families talk about a firstborn grandchild. Theo's company is in talks with a major retailer, my father would say, eyes bright. Theo's been invited to speak at a conference, my mother would add. I would nod and ask for the mashed potatoes. What they didn't know, what no one in my family knew, was that 8 months earlier, Aldercrest Capital had become one of Vantix's investors. It wasn't my deal. I want to be clear about that. A colleague named Foster had sourced it and led the diligence. I was brought in 3 weeks before close to review the financial model, because Foster was managing 2 other deals simultaneously and needed a second set of eyes. I almost recused myself when I saw the company name, but Theo and I hadn't spoken in over a year at that point, and I told myself it was a professional review, not a personal one. I signed off on the investment. The numbers were solid, mostly because of Raj's product, and the market timing was good. Vantix took $2.1 million from our fund as part of a larger seed round. Theo never knew I was involved. The way our fund works, individual managing directors are not publicly disclosed as decision makers on specific deals. Our partners sign the paperwork. My name was in the internal documentation, but not anywhere a founder would typically see it. So my brother took our firm's money and went on building his company and posting about his journey on LinkedIn. And I went on doing my job. And our family went on gathering for holidays, where I was the quiet one with the stable benefits job. And he was the one with the future. Then came the Founders Forum. The Founders Forum is an annual event hosted by a coalition of Chicago area venture funds, including ours. It's a full-day conference, panels in the morning, a pitch competition in the afternoon, a dinner in the evening, high profile, invite only, the kind of event where deals get made in hallway conversations. Vantix had been selected as one of 6 finalists for the afternoon pitch competition. The prize was $500,000 in additional funding from a pool contributed by the participating firms, including Aldercrest. I was on the selection committee. I didn't select Fontix. Another committee member did before I joined the committee mid-cycle. But when I saw the finalist list, I saw Theo's name, and I felt something I can only describe as a low, cold hum in my chest. Not anger exactly, more like the recognition that something was coming that I had no script for. I almost requested to be removed from the event entirely. I spent 3 days going back and forth. In the end, I decided I wasn't going to shrink from my own professional life because of my brother's presence in it. That was the old pattern. I was done with the old pattern. I did not tell my parents I would be there. I did not tell Theo. The morning of the forum, I got a text from my mother. Theo's big presentation is today. We're so proud of him. Say a prayer for him if you get a chance. I put my phone in my bag and drove to the venue. I want to pause here for a second, because I think some of you reading this know exactly what that text felt like. Not because it was cruel. My mother didn't mean it cruelly. She genuinely didn't know. That's almost harder to explain to people than deliberate cruelty. When someone purposely ignores you, there's clarity to it. You know what you're dealing with. When someone simply doesn't see you, when your absence from their mental picture of the world isn't malice but just blind habit, it does something different to you. It hollows. I had not told my parents about the forum because some part of me had learned, over years, not to offer them things they might forget to value. The morning sessions went well. I sat on a panel about risk assessment frameworks and answered questions and shook hands and did the work I always do. Around noon during the lunch break, I was at the coffee station when I felt someone stop behind me. "Vivian?" I turned around. Theo looked genuinely startled. His lanyard said presenter. Mine said managing director. Aldercrest Capital. He looked at my lanyard, then at my face, then at my lanyard again. "You work for Aldercrest?" he said. "Yes," I said. "Since when?" 18 months ago." He opened his mouth and closed it. There was a thing happening behind his eyes that I recognized. The rapid recalculation, the memory scanning for what this meant, what I might know, what my presence here implied about my role in his world. Were you involved in our funding round?" he asked. "I reviewed the financial model," I said. "The decision was sound. Why didn't you tell me?" I looked at him for a moment. "You never asked what I did," I said. "Not once in the last 3 years." He didn't have an answer for that. I refilled my coffee and went back to my seat. I need to stop here and tell you something about Theo that I had discovered 6 weeks before the forum. Something I hadn't told anyone yet because I was still deciding what to do with it. As an investor, Aldercrest has certain rights regarding Von Tix's financials, quarterly reports, access to bank records, the standard terms. After I disclosed my family connection to our compliance team, which I should have done at the start, I know, and the delay was my mistake, one I own fully, they assigned me a supervisory role on the account rather than removing me entirely, because my knowledge of the deal was by then too embedded to simply transfer. In reviewing the Q3 compliance package, I found a discrepancy. There was a line item in Vontix's expense reports labeled Strategic Partnership Development that totaled $187,000 across 7 months. The transactions were real, actual vendor payments, not ghost entries, but the vendors didn't exist in any way I could verify. The business names were registered LLCs in Delaware with no web presence, no employees, no identifiable purpose. I flagged it internally. Our compliance officer, a methodical woman named Harriet who I deeply respect, began a quiet investigation. What she found over the following 3 weeks was that the LLCs were beneficial owned by a holding company that traced, through 2 layers of structuring, back to a personal account in Theo's name. My brother had been paying himself $187,000 through fake vendor invoices. He had been stealing from his own investors, from our fund. From me in a way I hadn't anticipated when I signed off on that diligence. Harriet had advised me that we had grounds to issue a default notice and demand immediate repayment, and that we were likely obligated to report to the relevant authorities depending on how we chose to classify the conduct. She also told me that the timing, given the forum, was complicated. If we moved before his pitch, we would effectively torpedo any chance of him raising additional capital, and he might argue we'd timed it punitively. If we waited until after, we'd face questions about why we let him present. I asked for 48 hours to consider the path forward. That was the morning of the forum. I sat in the audience for the afternoon pitch competition with Harriet on one side of me and our general counsel on the other. My brother walked on stage looking confident and polished in a gray suit I didn't recognize. He was good at this. I'll give him that. He had a way of making a room feel like it was in on something exciting, like they were being led into a secret. He pitched for 18 minutes. The slides were clean. The market data was accurate. Raj's product demo was genuinely impressive. And then, near the end, Theo put up a slide showing their cap table and investor list, and the Aldercrest logo was on it. And then he said, "We've been fortunate to have strong institutional support, including from Aldercrest Capital, one of the most respected VC firms in the Midwest." The room nodded approvingly. I was sitting 20 feet away from him. He hadn't seen me in the audience. The stage lights were bright enough that the first few rows of seating were probably indistinct to him. I watched him take questions from the judging panel with poise, deflecting the hard ones, leaning into the soft ones, doing the thing he had always been gifted at, making people believe in him. I thought about my mother's text, "Say a prayer for him." I thought about the Thanksgiving when I'd been promoted to managing director and hadn't mentioned it because she'd immediately pivoted to asking about Theo's latest article. I thought about the Christmas where my father had said, in front of extended family, that he wished I had Theo's drive. I thought about every time I had made myself smaller so that the comparison wouldn't sting as much. And then I thought about Harriet's file, the shell companies, the $187,000. The panel finished their questions. The moderator thanked Theo and began to transition to the next presenter. And then one of the judges, a woman I'll call Daphne, a GP at another fund, leaned into her microphone and said, "I'd actually like to ask one more question, if that's all right. For the Aldercrest representative in the room, is there anything you'd like to add to your continued confidence in this company?" It was a standard thing to ask. A courtesy. The kind of question that usually gets a brief, positive nod from whoever the fund is sent. Everyone turned to look at the Aldercrest section. They looked at me. Theo looked at me. I watched his face go through several things very quickly. I stood up. "Thank you," I said. "I do have a few remarks." The room went quiet in the particular way. Rooms go quiet when something unexpected is happening and everyone can feel it. "I should disclose," I said, "that the founder of Vantix, Theodore Calloway, is my brother. I should have made that disclosure at the start of our investment relationship, and I have since corrected that with our compliance team." I heard a murmur. Theo had gone very still. "I also need to inform this panel and the other participating funds that Aldercrest has identified material financial irregularities in Vantix's recent expense reporting, and that we have notified our general counsel and are in the process of issuing formal documentation to the company. For that reason, Aldercrest is not in a position to offer a positive endorsement of Vantix at this time, and we would ask that this panel take that into account in their deliberations." The silence after I sat down was the loudest thing I have ever heard. I am not going to tell you it felt triumphant. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think when people imagine moments like this, They imagine a kind of clean satisfaction, a movie score swell, the villain getting their due. It didn't feel like that. It felt like grief and adrenaline combined, a shaking in my hands that I controlled by pressing them flat on my thighs, and an awareness that my brother was standing at a podium looking at me like I had become someone he didn't recognize. Maybe I had. The moderator called a brief recess. Theo was escorted off stage by the event coordinator. Harriet and RGC moved to a side room to begin the formal notification process. I sat in my chair and didn't move for a while. A woman came and sat next to me, Renata, a GP from one of the other funds, someone I knew slightly from prior events. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "That took something." "It was my job," I said. "Sure," she said. "But it took something." The next hour was one of the harder hours of my life. Theo and I ended up in a small room with Harriet, our GC, and a representative from the forum. Theo was not aggressive. That surprised me. He was pale and quiet and he kept looking at his hands. His lawyer, who arrived 40 minutes into the meeting, was better composed than he was. Theo did not deny the expense irregularities. He said, and I believe this was genuine, that he had told himself it was a form of correction, that as a founder he was underpaid relative to his contributions, that he'd intended to repay it once they closed the next round. He said it in the careful, disconnected way people talk when they're trying to describe a decision that made sense in a private logic they can no longer quite access. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When he was finished, I said, "The intent doesn't change the structure of what happened. You know that." He nodded. "Aldercrest will pursue formal remediation. I don't control how far that goes, that's above my level. But I wanted you to hear from me directly what the process will be." He looked at me and said in a voice that was very quiet, "How long have you known?" "6 weeks," I said. "Why didn't you call me?" "I had professional obligations," I said. "I couldn't tip you off. You understand that." He did understand it. That was the thing about Theo. He wasn't stupid. He understood the logic of systems, the rules of the world he had chosen to play in. He had just thought he was exempt from them. "Mom and Dad are going to," he started. "I know," I said. "They'll blame you." "I know that too," I said. He looked at the table. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the company thing, obviously, but also for not." He stopped. I waited. "I didn't know you were this," he said finally, gesturing vaguely at the room, at me, at the lanyard still around my neck. "I don't know how I didn't know that." "You didn't ask," I said, not unkindly. "Just as a fact." He nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "I didn't ask. I want to stop here because I think this is the part that people who haven't lived something like this might not fully understand. The apology from Theo. It mattered, and it also didn't fix anything. And both of those things were true simultaneously. Forgiveness isn't a switch, it's not a moment. It's a long, slow process that looks different on different days, and I was nowhere near the end of it. What I had in that room was honesty. For the first time in my adult life, my brother was looking at me and seeing me clearly. Not the quiet sister with the stable job, not the one who didn't have his drive. Me, exactly as I was. It was small, and it was the beginning of something, and I held on to it carefully because I didn't know yet how fragile it was. My parents called that night. My mother called first. Her voice was tight and strange. And she said she'd heard from Theo, and was it true that I had? And then she didn't quite finish the sentence. "Yes," I said. "How could you do that to your brother?" I had expected this. I had not expected that it would still find a way to land. "Mom," I said, "Theo committed fraud. Against our investors. Against my firm. He's your family. He stole money." There was a long pause. "You always resented him," she said. "I just never wanted to see it." I closed my eyes. "I'm going to say something to you, and I need you to actually hear it. I have spent the last 7 years building a career that I am proud of, and I have done it quietly because every time I shared it with this family, it disappeared in the next sentence. I am a managing director at one of the most respected venture capital firms in the Midwest. I have been since I was 30 years old. And you found out tonight because your son's fraud case put my name in a room I had a right to be in. Silence. I didn't say any of this to hurt you, I said. Or Theo. I did my job because it was my job, and because the alternative was to compromise my integrity for someone who has never extended the same courtesy to me. My mother said, I didn't know. I know you didn't, I said. That's the part I'm still working through. My father called an hour later. His conversation was shorter. He asked me what was going to happen to Theo. I told him honestly. There would likely be a civil process, possibly referral to authorities depending on how the investigation concluded. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I didn't know what you did. No, I said. I should have asked. That sentence, from my father, in that voice. I won't pretend it didn't matter. It did. 3 words that didn't undo anything and still somehow named the wound. Yeah, I said. You should have. The formal outcomes took several months to unfold. Theo agreed to a civil settlement with Aldercrest and the other defrauded investors, including a structured repayment plan and the immediate removal of himself from Vantix's executive team. Raj took over as CEO. The company, with some restructuring and a very different board dynamic, eventually stabilized. Theo was not criminally charged. The amounts and the structure of the fraud fell into a range where our counsel and the relevant parties agreed a civil resolution was appropriate and sufficient. I was not involved in those negotiations. I kept my job. My disclosure failure, not flagging my brother connection at the start, was noted in my compliance file, and I received a formal reprimand. I accepted it. I had made a mistake. The reprimand was fair. My brother and I have spoken 4 times since the forum. The conversations are careful. We are 2 people learning to exist in an honest relationship for the first time, and it is slow work, and some days I don't know if it's work worth doing, and other days I think it might be the most important thing I'm doing. I don't have a clean answer about Theo. I don't think clean answers are honest ones. My parents have been in therapy. This surprised me more than almost anything else in this story. My mother called me 3 months after the forum and told me she and my father had started seeing a family therapist, and that the therapist had given her an exercise where she had to write down what she knew about each of her children's lives. She said she got to 8 things for Theo and ran out. She said she could only get to 3 for me. I want to know more, she said. If you'll tell me. I told her about Aldercrest. I told her about the fund, the deals I'd worked on, the moment I'd gotten the managing director offer, and had cried in a Walgreens parking lot because I had no one to call. I told her about the 4 blazers I'd rotated for 3 years, and the lunch at my desk, and the spreadsheets that told the truth. She listened. She didn't try to connect it to Theo. At the end, she said, I'm so proud of you. I have heard those words before, from mentors, from colleagues, from my own reflection in the occasional generous moment. But I had never heard them from her, directed at me, about my life, without a redirect attached. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, Thank you, I've worked really hard. I know, she said. I'm sorry it took me this long to see it. I'm not going to end this by telling you everything is repaired, because it isn't. Families don't get fixed in a season. The favoritism that shaped me and my brother didn't appear overnight, and it won't dissolve overnight. Some of the ways I learned to be small have required years of unlearning and will probably require a few more. Some of the ways Theo learned to be the center have made him capable of rationalizing a fraud, and that has consequences that outlast any settlement. What I can tell you is what I know now, standing on this side of it. I can tell you that staying quiet to avoid comparison didn't protect me. It just made me invisible to people who should have been looking. I can tell you that the work I did in the margins, in the early mornings and late nights, in the spreadsheets nobody saw, that work was real and it had weight, even when no one was counting it. I can tell you that doing the right thing professionally, when the person it affects is someone you love, is one of the loneliest and most necessary things I have ever done. And I can tell you this. The moment my brother looked at my lanyard and saw my title and said, How long have you known? In that moment, I was not invisible. I was exactly and completely myself, in a room I had earned, holding knowledge I had built. Making a decision I could stand behind. That's not a small thing. That's the whole thing, actually. I've thought a lot about what actually caused everything that happened, not in a dramatic, looking for blame kind of way, but in the quiet way you revisit things when the noise finally settles. Theo didn't steal because he was a bad person from the beginning. He stole because for 35 years he had been told that the rules bent for him, that exceptions were reasonable when they applied to him, that his vision, his potential, his name on a pitch deck justified a different standard. My parents didn't teach him that with cruelty, they taught him that with love that was slightly misaimed, love that skipped past accountability and landed on praise every single time. You raise someone that way long enough, and eventually they start to believe that the gap between what they're owed and what they've been given is something they're allowed to quietly close on their own terms. That's not a judgment, it's just what happens when the feedback loop breaks early. And me. I made my own version of the same mistake, just in the opposite direction. I learned that being visible was dangerous, so I made myself invisible. I learned that sharing my wins led to comparisons, so I stopped sharing. I told myself it was professionalism, maturity, not needing external validation. Some of that was true, but some of it was just old fear wearing a better outfit. The fact that my mother could only name 3 things about my life after 7 years of my career, I have to own my part in that. Invisibility isn't always done to you, sometimes you participate in it. What I know now is that integrity isn't just about the big moments. It's not only about standing up in a conference room and saying hard things in front of 40 people. It's about the 7 years of lunch at my desk and 4 rotating blazers and staying until 8. Because the work mattered, even when no one was counting. Those years weren't waiting. They were building. There's a difference, and it took me a long time to understand it. Intelligence without honesty is just a sharper tool for getting away with things. Theo was intelligent, so was the structure he built around those shell companies, 2 layers of holding entities. Clean vendor names, plausible line items, smart, and completely hollow, because it was built to deceive rather than to last. Anything built on a crooked foundation eventually tells on itself. Not because the universe is keeping score in some mystical ledger, but because systems have audits, and numbers have patterns, and people like me exist specifically to find them. I think about Harriet a lot. She did her job without drama, without ego, methodically and correctly. She is the kind of person who makes institutions function. Watching her work reminded me why I got into this field. Not for the titles or the fund size or the managing director lanyard, but because honest analysis is one of the most useful things a person can offer the world. It protects people, sometimes it protects them from someone they love. What I want to leave you with, if you've ever been the quiet one, the one whose contributions don't make it into the family story, the one who stopped announcing things because the room never quite held them, is this: the work is still real. Your presence in rooms you've earned is still legitimate. You don't need to be loud to be significant. But you do need to stop making yourself smaller as a kindness to people who should be doing the work of seeing you. I'm still learning that. Most days, I'm better at it than I used to be. That's enough.